Jeff, question for you. Two questions for you. First, what is the closest point to continental Hawaii? And second, what is the closest inhabited continental city to Hawaii? What do you think?
The closest continental landmass, as in part of like an actual continental body, I'm going to guess what you're
That's
alluding
right.
to. I'm actually going to guess that it's potentially, well, actually, here's my guess. My guess is that it's going to be Australia. I don't
Okay.
know this for sure, but I'm going to guess it's going to be Australia. But I'm going to guess that the nearest like city, like major
Mhm.
city that is to Hawaii, I'm going to guess that's actually Tokyo. Am I?
Okay.
How close am I here?
You're sort of close.
All right.
Let me break it down. So first of all, we have to understand that Hawaii is an archipelago which consists of eight main islands, but 132 islands, atolls, reefs, shallow bank shoals, and seamounts that stretch for 1,500 miles. So that kind of, depending where we pick, matters quite a bit.
I think that's the popular imagination of what Hawaii is.
No, I mean, the big islands
right?
are the larger
Mhm.
islands, the main islands are all somewhat close together, but it does stretch out fairly far into the northwest. And so the big island of Hawaii is on one side. And then if you go all the way to the northwest, there's the Kure Atoll, which is the northernmost atoll in the world. And it's about 1,500 miles from Nitroff Point on Tignock Island in the southwestern point of the Aleutian Islands, which is part of Alaska.
Oh, so it was North America.
So it turns out it was Alaska, and the Aleutian Islands go pretty far. And this is the southernmost point in Alaska as well. So this is an area that is not inhabited by humans, either of these places, right? So this is kind of one answer that we could give. Kure Atoll has no human inhabitants, it's a bird sanctuary, and it's 1,400 miles from Honolulu and about 2,500 miles from Tokyo. So, okay. But it turns out that the closest place in the lower 48 to Hawaii is Point Arena Lighthouse on the Mendocino coast in Northern California, 130 miles north of San Francisco, which is, I guess, a little closer than. So Tokyo, by one definition, is pretty close. But generally speaking, the largest city is probably San Francisco. That's closest to the main islands. Hawaii, the main islands are about 4,000 miles from Japan. But it is one of the closest places.
I'm going to take my half correct answer and call that a win.
I think that's good because it was kind of a hard question. There are many Polynesian islands in the South Pacific, the closest of which are approximately 2,000 miles away. So maybe one of those might fit in there in another definition of the closest place. So the Hawaiian Islands, what's up?
It is funny that the closest sort of continental body is Alaska or the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, because for one, very different kind of islands. If you've ever seen or experienced the Aleutian Islands and obviously experienced Hawaii, these are going to be two very stark contrasts in terms of what they're giving the visitor. But two, we just had an entire episode all about Alaska that you can listen to last week. And so this is our episode all about Hawaii, obviously.
And if you didn't listen to the Alaska episode, you should after this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that there's already a geographic connection between these two.
There is a connection. There's several connections, although as you pointed out, they're very different places ecologically and culturally.
Right.
So a quick bit here, the Hawaiian Islands were formed from a hotspot, and a hotspot is volcano in the middle of a tectonic plate. And in this case, the volcano is in the middle of the Pacific plate, which expels magma until it erupts onto the seafloor and then eventually forms, in this case, the Hawaiian Islands. And a lot of the area in between North America and Hawaii is very deep, so there aren't a whole lot of islands in between. So Jeff, another question for you. Considering how far Hawaii is from other inhabited areas, how do you think people first came to Hawaii and from where?
Well, I think I can give you at least a semi-correct answer here because I've done a few videos and research on other Polynesian areas of the world. And so I know, for example, that ethnically the native peoples of Hawaii are descendant from the sort of ancient Polynesian peoples. And so I know that originally those people sort of originated in the Southeast Asian, Indonesian sort of areas. And just like they spread around to, the other islands of, Polynesia, Melanesia, New Zealand eventually, on their sailboats. I'm guessing eventually some took a really long sail trip north from, let's say, New Caledonia or Fiji, and just decided that they're going to go until they hit something, and somebody hit Hawaii at some point. I'm going to guess pretty late in the game, relatively speaking, just based on how I know that New Zealand was first theorized to have had human contact around 1200. How close am I here?
This is a very good answer. I'd say you've probably nailed almost the entire thing here. Let me break it down from my notes, but what you said sounds really good to me. So there's no written records of this situation. There's an archaeological record. So from the analyses of pottery, migrations across the Pacific can be partially traced. So for thousands of years, as you pointed out, Proto-Polynesian people sailed east from Southwest Asia, from New Guinea, to Melanesia, to Polynesia, settling in places that included Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Tahiti. They went at least as far as Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and New Zealand, as you pointed out. There is debate on the timing of this. So I looked at a bunch of different estimates that situate the arrival of people to Hawaii between 100 and 900 Common Era. So that's a pretty large range there.
It's a large range.
What's that?
But it's a large range, but it's sooner than New Zealand, which I would not have expected because, New Zealand's pretty far south.
Right.
But Hawaii, I think, is much more distant from that trajectory.
It's more distant from Southwest Asia, or Southeast Asia, excuse me. But from the South Pacific Islands, like Tahiti, for example, I think it's probably closer than New Zealand.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right.
We should probably check that, but I think that's the case. I did see one reference that suggests that Polynesians may have reached Hawaii as far back as 2,000 years ago. So I'm not sure which is correct, but this doesn't seem to be the general view. But in any case, 2,000 years ago, that adds up, right? Yeah, that adds up pretty well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the long view, right? So given all that, the first wave of people arriving in Hawaii at that time, it wasn't a one-way thing. It wasn't like we've gotten there and we're done, let's just never go back. They arrived in double-hulled voyaging canoes that traveled some 2,000 miles from Polynesia. These are canoes that were incredibly advanced, constructed without metal tools. And so there was a back and forth happening there between some places in Polynesia and in Hawaii. After the first wave of people arriving in Hawaii, there was the arrival of another wave of Polynesians that are thought to have arrived around in the 1200s. So 12. So there may have been hundreds and hundreds, maybe even close to 1,000 years in between some of these different waves of people coming from Polynesia. Initially, the first Polynesians who arrived brought at least 24 species with them, so seeds, cuttings, tubers, a number of animals. Now think about the fact that this was in an open canoe exposed to seawater. If I try to move a plant from my backyard to my front yard, it often doesn't make it, I can't. So to be able to preserve these species over 2,000 miles in the open sea is, I think, a remarkable thing.
Absolutely. We know a lot about the colonization of the Americas through the European context, right? Columbus, 1492 sailed the open blue, whatever, something like that. And so we know a lot about the technology that they employed during those long voyages. And even during that time, which at this point is at least hundreds of years later, with, metalworking, sophisticated shipbuilding, all this kind of stuff, we know that oftentimes a lot of these sailors got really sick from not having the nutrients and not being able to preserve their food in the right way, let alone carrying full-on plants over. So it's remarkable that the Polynesians were able to do this over arguably, at least theoretically, potentially longer distances too.
Well, and part of the reason for that has to be that Polynesians had been doing this for a long time. So, European, that story is well documented because we have all kinds of written histories about it. But Polynesians for thousands of years have been traveling the open sea without the kind of navigational tools that Europeans had. And so they had the shipbuilding technology, the canoe building technology, and the knowledge to be able to navigate the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest body of water in the world.
Yeah, very incredible. And when you start to think about it, it's like, well, with respects to how big the Pacific Ocean is, the Hawaiian Islands are a relative needle in the haystack, right? So it's like, how did they even know, or how did they even find it? Was it just random luck? Did they just happen upon it and that was it? And then how did they find it again? There's all these things that I'm sure maybe people know, but maybe has also been lost to time.
I think finding it again was a question of that there's the traditions involved being able to recount the travel in a way that others would be able to replicate, I think, is part of the reason for that. And then why? Well, I think that this was part of the tradition of these people to find new places to settle. It may have been that there was overpopulation. I mean, that's speculated. It's speculated there could have been warfare. It could have been the aspirations of a particular chief who wanted to find something new. So there's possible explanations. I wonder if in oral tradition in Hawaii, maybe there's some information about this, but I was not able to uncover any of that information myself. And I've limited to reading things in English, for example. One other thing here. The animals that came on I think probably one of the first voyages included domesticated pigs, chickens, and dogs. And it's also speculated that a small black rat made the voyage as a castaway. So that's a consistent thing across cultures, is that rats like to jump on ships and go to new places. It is speculated the first people who discovered Hawaii came from the Marquesas Islands, which is again around 2,000 miles away, and subsequently from Bora Bora and other islands in that part of the South Pacific. So let's consider for a moment how space was organized politically by the people who became eventually the Hawaiian people. Now, prior to 1810, so for hundreds and hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, the islands were ruled by various chiefs, the Ali'i. Social and political traditions from the South Pacific developed over the centuries, so they're similar, but they became distinct. And those included how chiefs and different groups of people related to one another. There were sometimes conflict, and so there are records, apparently, or oral records of warfare happening between some of these chiefs from time to time. Apparently, there were past attempts to conquer, or others might say unite, the Hawaiian Islands under single rule, but none were successful until the early 1800s. So these are places that developed relationships with each other through different groups of people, but they weren't ruled by one ruler until the 1800s.
I'm going to guess there's a reason for that specific time period, and I'm guessing we're going to get to that.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the reason, but there's a big change that happened around that time that probably explains a lot. Another thing that's interesting I found is that trips between Hawaii and the South Pacific seem to have stopped around 1300 Common Era. So at that point, society becomes pretty isolated from the rest of the world and are interacting with each other throughout the different islands. Was it complete isolation? It's hard to say. There's no known evidence for contact after that time. We can't rule out that there were encounters with people from other places, maybe other waves from Polynesia, or a little later, possibly Europeans. Apparently, there were Spanish sailors who documented the Hawaiian Islands, but there's no record of them making contact with the people there or making landfall or anything like that. So, in other words, for hundreds and hundreds of years, Hawaii develops, what is now Hawaii, develops pretty independently from other places. But this eventually came to an end. And so in any case, on January 18th, 1778, this is the specificity which we can use when we're talking about European explorers, because they have a written record of things, right? So a British Royal Navy officer and his crew caught sight of Oahu, and 2 days later, they landed on Kauai. And the name of this British officer was Captain Cook, James Cook.
There's only like 3 of them that ever appear in basically all of our podcast episodes at this point. There's Vancouver, there's Cook, and then there's obviously, Christopher Columbus that we usually talk about, with respects to his voyages. Those typically tend to be the 3 primary European names we hear. So I'm not surprised at all.
It's interesting that those are the ones that come up. It turns out that Captain Cook made 3 voyages through the Pacific, and I think they caught sight during one, and I think it was in the last voyage that they made contact. I might have that wrong, but anyways, this all happens in 1778, where the contact is made. So the convention among European sailors is to name things as they go, and to name them for usually people or places back in Europe. I suppose people all over the world name things. But the difference is that Europeans made maps to record their voyages, and place names were both a way of identifying places for future reference and for laying claim to territory. And so we know that European territoriality works very different than other places in the world. So the tradition of cartography, and Cook was a cartographer that emerged from Europe, was very much tied to imperialism, the effort to control lands in different parts of the planet. And so because Europeans like to name things, Cook named the island chain the Sandwich Islands in honor of his benefactor, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, John Montagu. And this is the same guy that, bread with cold cuts and some lettuce or whatever version of that. That's the sandwich that we know about. It's named for the same guy, it turns out.
I really wanted to ask that question, but I also didn't because it seems so silly. That's really incredible that's one, that's where we get the word sandwich from. I think I had heard some variation of that, but also that the Hawaiian Islands were originally named the Sandwich Islands.
It's an illustration of how powerful that convention of European cartography really is,
right?
To be able to start to call places by particular names and thus associate that. And I guess that's true for food too, but that'll be a different episode, I think.
Right. It reminds me of the Alaskan Denali Mountain, right?
That's
Denali,
a good
it's
example.
a really big mountain. It used to be named Mount McKinley. It only recently was changed back. But it's like this idea that all these different places get named after all these different people from way far on the other side of the world.
Who have never been to these places.
And it's almost the expectation that, well, that's what it's going to be named forever from now on, based on sort of that European convention. And it's kind of impressive that I would say not very many people would ever know that Hawaii was originally named after some person in Europe, right? I think that's pretty impressive that they were able to break away from that.
Well, I mean, of course, the people who lived there referenced it in different ways, but probably didn't reference the entire chain by a particular name. But there was one island, the Big Island, we call it, that is Hawaii. And that was one of the names of one of the islands in this archipelago. A quick just note on Captain Cook. He returned to Hawaii in 1779. So I guess that was the last trip. In an attempt to take the king of Hawaii captive, he was killed by individuals in a crowd that sought to save their king from capture. So that, we've talked about Cook. That's the demise of Captain Cook.
Interesting. On Hawaii, of all places. I did not know that.
Yep. Obviously, there's more to say, and we'll say more after a quick break.
All right, let's do it.
And we're back. We're talking about Geography is Hawaii on the episode today. That's the episode for the podcast today. And we just discussed the development of the peopling of what are now the Hawaiian Islands, and then the initial contact between Europeans and Hawaiians. For native Hawaiians, contact with Cook's crew and subsequent sailors from Europe connected Hawaiians to the world in a very new and dramatic way. So globalization, which we could define in lots of different ways, has really been going on for a very long time. And contact with the outside world meant change for Hawaii and the Hawaiian people. For one, diseases from Europe had a devastating effect on Hawaiian people. These diseases included influenza, measles, and smallpox, to which Hawaiian people had no immunity. Tuberculosis. I mean, these are diseases that sailors were succumbing to also on these ships, but Europeans had developed some resistance to these diseases. And when they encountered new people, the people didn't have any kind of immunity. This is another example of what we've talked about before as ecological imperialism, a term coined by Alfred Crosby. We discussed that in previous episodes, particularly our invasive species episode. So check that out if you're interested in learning more about that concept. Contact with others in the globe also meant becoming part of the global economy. And this was another dramatic change that led to even more change for people in Hawaii. And the global economy, part of it was dominated at the time by imperial and colonial European countries, including Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands. And another thing that changed, let me just mention this quick, is that coming in contact with new people means coming in contact with people with different belief systems and different religions. And the followers of Christianity in particular were looking for converts. So that was another change. That things change very quickly when you start to tap into a world that has already been in contact. And those changes are what we're going to talk about next.
It's interesting thinking, I guess, outside of the Christianity, missionary sort of conversation. It's interesting thinking about, as one of, let's say Great Britain stumbles upon these islands, sort of seeing it's interesting to sort of know what they saw value in for those islands, right? I think early colonization efforts, particularly in the 15 and 1600s, were so heavily focused on, first, let's grab all the gold we can from these civilizations.
Extraction of riches.
Right? There's a clear monetary value there. And then two, having vast swaths of land to then plant a bunch of crops that simply wouldn't grow in Europe, right?
That's right.
Sugar, we've talked extensively about sugar, but also coffee and other tropical or more tropical sort of plants. But Hawaii, it's interesting because it's so far away. Two, it's not that big relative to basically, let's say, Mexico, where Hernan Cortez originally landed, right?
Right.
So it's just, I'm wondering how that almost mathematical equation factors into sort of these colonial empires, or maybe they were just like, well, this is cool, we're going to claim it, but we don't have anything to do with it.
Yeah, no, I think that if they could extract some kind of economic value of it, had a lot to do with whether they came back and whether they established colonies there. So I think that sounds accurate to me. And so, up through the 1700s, we talked about how the Alihi, the chiefs, ruled different parts of different islands. But after European contact, there started to be a new effort to unite or to conquer all of Hawaii under one rule. And so that successfully happened in the early 1800s. And the ruler who managed to make this happen was Kamehameha. He was the first king in what became known as the Kingdom of Hawaii. He rose to power in the Kona region of the Big Island and consolidated power on that entire island around 1795. Traders from Great Britain provided guns and ammunitions to Kamehameha and other leaders of other groups. And so warfare took a different turn at this time because all of a sudden they had these weapons of modern warfare that they had gotten from Europe, gunpowder from China, and these new weapons were used in battles between rival chiefs. So Kamehameha went on to take power across the archipelago by 1810, which was the establishment of the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii. And it's named Hawaii because that was the island he was from. And he became supreme ruler of this kingdom. Kamehameha, he died in 1819, so 9 years after he consolidated power, and his son became ruler under the name Kamehameha II. And we're going to see that there are 5 kings in succession who take this name on.
It seems very I guess I don't want to assume that there wasn't a such thing as a kingdom under the, sort of ancient Polynesian societies, but it seems like they're more tribal and sort of chieftain oriented, which there are some ties there. But the idea of adopting the name kingdom and therefore then also having, heirs and adopting Kamehameha II, this all seems very European, as if one of the, maybe one of the European settlers who gave them weapons was like, hey, you should take these and sort of establish your own thing here.
Yeah. How exactly that played out, I would like to learn more about, and I won't be able to share that in this podcast, but it's not coincidental. I suspect that there were, as people in the Hawaiian Islands learned about the way things worked in other places, and realizing they're part of this world that was maybe going to come to them, some leaders decided they probably needed to be able to counter somewhat on those terms.
Mm-hmm.
So Kamehameha II did something really interesting. He abandoned the Hawaiian religion. So this was after contact, but a year before Protestant missionaries from New England arrived in 1820. So pretty quickly after taking power, he abolished kapu, which is the traditional spiritual laws that govern Hawaiian life. As an example, the traditional dance, the hula, was banned. Some religious sites were destroyed. So even before missionaries come to really start to heavily convert people to Christianity, the king decides to turn his back on those particular traditions and move forward with something new. Missionaries were, when they arrived, again, they arrived from New England, and they were very critical of Hawaiian culture and sought to instill their own culture in its place. This is a story of many places, but this happened here as well. In 1824, Kamehameha II helped create an alphabet for the Hawaiian people, who had generally passed on knowledge through and history through oral tradition. And so the Hawaiian people were not an illiterate people. They were a pre-literate people. You can't be illiterate if there's no written language. And
Right.
so they didn't have a written language, but this was introduced to them, and a Hawaiian language was transcribed using the Roman alphabet. And missionaries encouraged this primarily as a means of teaching the Bible to people in Hawaii. But King Kamehameha II wanted his people to be literate as a means of understanding and navigating power in the Western world. And it turns out that within 14 years, over 90% of Hawaiian people became literate, which was one of the absolute highest rates of literacy anywhere in the world,
Wow.
very quickly after written language was introduced.
That is an incredible statistic.
Right?
I mean, getting 90% of people from anywhere to do anything, learn anything new over such a relatively short period of time today would be pretty impressive. But thinking back then, when you couldn't just phone up a friend and tell them, share this information very quickly. It all had to be done very manually, very slowly across the islands. Very impressive.
Well, apparently Hawaiian and Polynesian traditions involved reciting word for word, prayers and poems and various, spoken text. And some of these were extremely long, that would take like part of a day or more of a day to recount, something like that. And so this was a group of people who were already well-versed in remembering things pretty well related to language. So this was a twist. In 1824, Kamehameha went to England to meet with King George IV to promote recognition of the Kingdom of Hawaii as a sovereign state. And this is notable because Hawaii is making an effort here, seeing the way that the world exists, to get international recognition for their kingdom. Incidentally, this meeting never happened because the king and Queen Kamamalu both got measles and died in London on July 14th, 1824. So that we see Kamehameha II was in power for a short time, had a pretty big impact. And his brother then became king under the name Kamehameha III.
This feels like one of those sort of, confluence points of history where, had something gone a little bit different, had Kamehameha II and his wife not died before they met the king, maybe there would have been a very different outcome for the Hawaiian Islands. Maybe there could have been something different that happened there. Because, well, I don't know. I guess maybe we're going to find this out. But does Great Britain ever formally recognize them as their own country?
They do. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So does France. Right. And so under previous kings, there's an effort to gain official recognition of their sovereignty from places all over the world. And a lot of this is accomplished. So, as we go through the 1800s, the Kingdom of Hawaii is recognized, not by everywhere, but by many places as a sovereign territorial state. It was Kamehameha III that really pushed the literacy campaign that his brother had started. And starting in the 1820s and the 1830s, immigrants and the children of immigrants from Europe and the United States began to establish sugar plantations in Hawaii. And
there it is.
From my understanding, it would be very hard to overstate the importance of the sugar industry in transforming what happened in Hawaii from that point forward, and mostly in ways that would result in Native Hawaiians losing political power, control over their land, and for many, the loss of their lives as well.
Right. I mean, this is something. I mean, we've talked about sugar plenty of times on this podcast. It's one of those things where, one, sugar is a very valuable crop during this time. It can only grow in very specific areas, and when you're able to grow something someplace that's that profitable, there's going to be a drive to capitalize on that land and then eventually control it outright, right? Because you're not going to want to be subjected to, a different country, a different, kingdom, if you're really trying to sell it back to the United States or, Great Britain or whoever wants it, right? That's who you want all of your dealings to be with. So it's not surprising at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's incredible to think about the global extent that existed even at that time, where this very relatively remote place, Hawaii, all of a sudden became part of the global economy, and ships were taking sugar to Europe, and they weren't doing it through the Panama Canal because that didn't exist. So they had to sail all around the tip, through the tip of, past the tip of South America. And these were long voyages, yet somehow this was economically profitable. Demand for sugar, incidentally, increased during the U.S. Civil War. And in 1875, and this is also very significant, in 1875, the king signs a reciprocity treaty with the United States that allowed sugar from Hawaii to be sold in the United States without tariffs. So that makes growing sugar in Hawaii even more attractive for people in the United States, or for people who are selling sugar to the United States, because they won't have to pay a tariff.
But I'm guessing, because I think, we obviously know where Hawaii is today with respects to the global economy, whatever. I'm guessing that people who are growing sugar in Hawaii are still subject to taxes by the Hawaiian government. That might prove to be an issue down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what that looked like at the time, but the major factor for considering trade was what kind of tariffs are going to be levied against you for importing,
for bringing it in. Yeah,
that's right. And also, from the very beginning, the people who are generally benefiting from this are European and American settlers who have established these plantations. Starting in the 1850s, due to these plantations and to the declining population of Native Hawaiians, a steady influx of immigrants from abroad came to Hawaii to work in the plantations. And these were primarily people from the Philippines, which apparently was the largest group of people who arrived, followed by people from China, Japan, Korea, the Marshall Islands, and other places as well. But this immigration continued in the 20th and the 21st century, and this helps us understand why Hawaii has this very rich ethnic and cultural diversity that it has today. As Europeans and Americans developed plantations, Hawaiian people, however, became displaced from land. And that economic desire that we talked about earlier on the part of Europeans caused a lot of problems and disenfranchisement for the local people. Through Kamehameha IV and V, the Kingdom of Hawaii signed treaties with countries across the world who recognized the sovereignty of Hawaii, and we talked about that a few moments ago. So this was a kingdom that was recognized as independent, and that's going to change, but we can't talk about that until after we take a short break.
Okay, let's hit our final ad break, and then we will come back and we'll, I guess, finish this episode up with talking about how Hawaii became part of the United States, I'm guessing.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about geography is Hawaii. And we were just discussing the rise of sugar plantations as a way of economic wealth for Europeans and Americans. Wealth did not flow particularly heavily to the Hawaiian people themselves. So Kamehameha V, he passes away, and the next king is Kalakaua. Kalakaua becomes the next king. He was the first leader from any other country to be invited to a state dinner at the U.S. White House. So not to visit the United States, but to be invited to a formal state dinner. So this illustrates that the United States sees this as a head of state from someplace else. In 1881, he made a trip around the world. He attended the International Exposition of Electricity in Paris, which is a way of shouting out our World Fairs episode. If you haven't checked that out, you might want to check it out.
I was just going to ask if that was a World's Fair, and then I was also going to do a plug for our World's Fair episode.
I think it was one of the smaller ones, but I'm not sure. But I think
go check it.
Yeah,
go check out that episode. It's a really fun exploration of this very wacky concept, which still exists today.
and we tie in all these different things as an illustration that these things aren't isolated from each other. These different phenomenon, different places, they're all connected in different ways. So it's useful for us to help make those connections and let you, the listener, know that if you want to follow this thread in a different direction, there's a way to do that through our podcasts.
Exactly.
And so Kalakaua, he also met Thomas Edison in New York and became enamored with the idea of using electricity as a means of powering the kingdom instead of using gas. And so he had electric lights installed in Iolani Palace in 1886, which is over 5 years before the White House had that technology installed.
Interesting.
Yep. Less than 2 years later, the streets of Honolulu were also powered by electricity. And in 1890, some 800 residences also had electric lights. I'm guessing many of them probably of European descent, but I don't have any statistics on that beyond that. Kalakaua, though, began to bring back some of the cultural practices that had been banned in the 1820s and was sort of bringing forth this idea of pride and something that we would probably identify as nationalism today. And so the hula, Hawaiian music, traditional healing practices, genealogies, traditional stories were revived under Kalakaua. And these are things that had been, of course, minimized by previous leaders, but particularly by the missionaries themselves. And the revival of these practices and the popularity of Kalakaua, King Kalakaua, were not well accepted by the Reform Party, aka the Missionary Party. So those who started to gain political power and work their way into the legislature and the cabinet within the Republic of Hawaii. So there were many European and Americans who were involved in having this political power. And the descendants, grandchildren mostly, of missionaries were powerful business people, particularly in the sugarcane industry. And they formed something called the Hawaiian League, which was an armed group that believed that Native Hawaiians should not rule Hawaii, but it should be the version of democracy as they saw it coming from the United States and Europe. And of course, the extent to which it was actually democratic is highly debatable, but that was their vision. And so we can see the conflict starting to form here.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, it's during this period of time, we've sort of been building up to this. The Hawaiian peoples are getting marginalized. They're still probably dying off at higher rates than the American and European settlers because of still diseases that they're probably still quite not immune to or have the expansive immunity as some of the other populations. So you can sort of see them, maybe getting marginalized on their lands, getting pushed off, these wealthy plantations. And one of the ways to potentially fight back against this, I can see from this king, is let's bring back some of our cultural heritage, right? We sort of cast that aside when we entered this globalized world, but let's bring some of it back so that we can now project what it is to be Hawaiian. What does it mean to be the kingdom of Hawaii?
That's right. That's exactly right. And we see similar phenomenon happening in other places, that you start to resurrect a culture and that there's political action that will often follow after that as well.
Exactly. And of course, as the whatever these missionary party, reform party, whatever they're called, these, settlers from other places, as they feel the Hawaiian culture getting revived a little bit, maybe expanding, they are, despite already being in such a place of wealth and power, they're probably seeing that any sort of, pushback against that is a total affront against them. And so now they're wanting to basically say, well, this is actually our island. Probably we probably should control it.
That's Accurate. That's completely accurate. That's what happens. Well, no, we know what's best for this place and what's best for us. And so it's not this. And so the Hawaiian League, which was this group that had an armed component to it, forced King Kalakaua at gunpoint to sign a document that devolved the king's power to the cabinet, which was controlled by descendants of missionaries, and restricted voting rights to just about everybody who was not white male landowner. So this is a classic move that we've seen in other places of disenfranchising a whole group of people and privileging white male landowners as the people who get to say what happens and get to have power. And this is
this is exactly what the United States has been for a long period of time. So it like everything lines up with exactly sort of with, and this might even be a little bit more, behind the times for the United States at the time, right? I don't know. I mean, obviously women weren't able to vote yet in the late 1890s, but I'm not sure how the structure of voting with respects to land ownership still was working within the United States. But regardless, it's definitely descendant from a period of time of extreme patriarchy within the United States, right? And that's kind of what they want again.
That's true. And it's done under the name of democracy, which is, again, pretty limited if you want to think about democracy. This document that the king signed began being referred to by Hawaiian people as the Bayonet Constitution, so to indicate that this was done under force. King Kalakaua traveled to San Francisco in 1891 for medical treatment. He was ill and he died in San Francisco. And so when they returned, the ship returned, they could see that the flag was at half-mast, and that indicated that the king had died. And so next in line was his sister, Liliuokalani, who became queen. And the tradition of family members inheriting chiefly powers, that does go back a long time. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they used 1, 2, 3, and 4 to demarcate what people's names were, but this was a strong tradition of family bonds. And so Liliuokalani becomes effectively the first queen of Hawaii. And so some statistics here to put into perspective: when Captain Cook arrived in 1778, the population of Hawaii was approximately 800,000 people. It's not known exactly, but that's one of the figures that I've seen floated around. And so that's 1778. And due to all the disease and the lack of immunity that we talked about, tuberculosis, venereal diseases, all kinds of different things, when Liliuokalani became queen, just a little over 100 years after contact with the Hawaiians with Cook, the population of Native Hawaiians was closer to 40,000 people.
Wow. I mean, that's what, 5% of the theorized population, which is...
I was told there'd be no math, but yeah, if that's what you say it is. But yeah, it's a lot less. Yeah, it's a brutal statistic. And this also helps us understand why so many people were brought from other countries in order to work sugar plantations, because there were fewer Native Hawaiians because of the rate of death from these terrible diseases. So Queen Liliuokalani, she undertakes a trip around the Hawaiian Islands to talk to her people, and they voice to her that this is not working. This is a situation in which they've become very estranged from their own land and lack a lot of power. And so Liliuokalani, with her cabinet, starts to draft a new constitution, and the new constitution would return voting power to the Hawaiian people. And this isn't like widely announced, but word of it gets out, because it's not officially announced yet. And that some of the children of the missionaries, the Hawaiian League, they were afraid of losing their political and economic power, so they weren't having this. And so on January 17th in 1893, a group of wealthy businessmen called the Committee of Safety, which is a term that's taken from the French Revolution, but I think is something that probably Orwell probably grabbed onto. I mean, the Committee of Safety is pretty much Orwellian as it gets, as far as I'm concerned. And so they had I think it was a Navy or Marine unit that was off the coast of Hawaii come in, and they marched in and they took power. They had a military coup, and this was done without explicit permission from Washington, D.C. So this was basically, in a way, a rogue group of individuals who were Americans and some military who took over Hawaii. This was not something that was didn't come from the powers in Washington, D.C. at that time.
That's incredible. The idea that a U.S. military unit, granted, there's not communications, not really
right.
It's not widespread back then, right? Obviously, but the idea that a U.S. military sort of command would, without explicit orders from Washington, D.C., would go ahead and overthrow an independent country.
In fact, President Grover Cleveland condemned the coup and publicly spoke in support of Queen Lulukalani. However, this begins a period of time called the Independent Republic, which again, that's the names of these things they hide a lot. This was from 1894 to 1898. And the United States sends an emissary to Hawaii to investigate the situation. And he stays for 4 months and does extensive interviews with Native Hawaiians, but also with Europeans and Americans. And he returns to Washington, D.C., and he writes a huge report. And the gist of the report is this coup was completely illegitimate. And the report advocated returning the Queen to power. So this is a U.S. emissary who's sent to Hawaii who says this shouldn't have happened, but things didn't play out the way that were suggested in that report. The Committee of Safety, sets up this provisional government, declares the Republic of Hawaii, and they named Sanford Dole as president. And Dole may seem familiar in connection to Hawaii because his cousin was the founder of the Dole Pineapple Empire.
Right. Yeah, which is still very prominent on. Well, at least Oahu. I know they have like a big plantation.
It is. And so this is part of the legacy of this takeover, this illegal coup of the of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And so the leaders of the Republic sought annexation to Washington, D.C. for one main reason. And that's because the United States had rescinded that agreement for reciprocity with Hawaii. And so they were now charging tariffs for sugar imports. And this cut into the profits of the sugarcane producers, the owners, dramatically. And so the idea is we have to become part of the United States because then we won't have to pay tariff anymore.
It always comes back to money. It
often comes back to money. This is a case of that. So we start to also see a lot of restrictions that are happening during this 4-year period. In 1896, the government of the Republic banned instruction of Hawaiian language and punished children for speaking Hawaiian in school. So this was another brutal repression on a cultural front. And the first efforts at annexation failed, and people in the United States and Congress people weren't sure that they wanted to take this on. But in 1898, and I think it probably has something to do with the conflict and the war, the United States taking control of the Philippines, the U.S. Congress decides to make Hawaii U.S. territory at that point. And so then they have the tariffs, they're not paying the tariffs, and power is invested in this small group of people who, have a record of their ancestors being in this place for, 80 years or 100 years or something like that, living among people who had been there for 1,000 or 2,000 years.
It is interesting thinking about this period of time, this late 1800s and even into the early 1900s. The United States back then it's not the same sort of United States today, this very massive global reach stretching sort of country. Now, obviously,
not at all in the 1800s. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the United States was still involved somewhat, but they were very much it was very much an isolationist mindset of the country, right? It was, we're doing ourselves and we don't really care about relatively, other people. So it's interesting to think that they would eventually, I guess it's interesting and not all that surprising that the first annexation of it would fail, right? They're just like, well, that's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. What do we want?
Right.
What possible advantage could that bring us?
Right, because they're not thinking about the benefit of this small group of sugar producers. They're thinking, what's in it for the United States? Now, of course, the United States was founded on colonizing and a big part of a continent, but the overseas sort of imperial colonial efforts of the United States wouldn't really start up into the 1900s. In the 1800s, there was some activity, but their power of the United States paled in comparison to the power of the Europeans at that time.
Absolutely. And you can see this even when we talked about this last week on our Alaska episode, when they purchased Alaska. For a long time, that was seen as a really stupid move. Like, why would you ever purchase? It's so far away. What are we ever going to do with it? You just wasted our money, and that area has nothing to do with us. We're manifest destiny. We're pushing all the way to the West Coast, right? That's what we want. That's the United States then. And so it's you can see this sort of same logic play out with Hawaii. It's like, that's stupid. Why would we want that? That would be another folly. Why would we annex that and then therefore also have to pay for anything that goes on over there?
That's right.
Of
Then
course,
it's
obviously
they have to protect, right? It's something that they have to.
Yep.
So it turns out that strategic military position was something that probably was attractive to members of Congress as well. And so that probably pushed it over the edge. And then starting in the 1900s, or maybe in the late 1800s, but I think in the 1900s, you have efforts to make Hawaii, take it from being a U.S. territory to becoming a state. And many of this initiative is not catching a lot of support in Congress, but that Hawaii was U.S. territory becomes pretty significant to the timing of the United States involvement in World War II. Because on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military launched an attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. And the next day, the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, asked Congress to declare war on Japan. So the United States, if we want to look at it from a historical perspective, is probably going to enter this conflict, was moving towards it. Mm-hmm. But this was the catalyst that made, and so it was in 1959, after the war, that Hawaii became a state, and it became the 50th state of the United States, so just after Alaska.
And I'm sure, I don't want to question the geographic knowledge of Americans at the time, but I'm sure after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it really put Hawaii on the map for Americans, for U.S. citizens, right? For people who otherwise had probably never heard it, right? Nobody's taking a continental flight over to Hawaii during this time. It's not a tropical destination for tourism, at least maybe not in the same scale as it is today. So this must have also been one thing. It's like, oh, what's this Hawaii I'm hearing about? That's ours. Why is it not a state?
That's right.
What's going on? It's being bombed. That seems like a very important thing if it's being bombed.
Our territory, right? Yeah.
It's our territory. That belongs to us. And then that just probably helps, maybe it should be a state after all.
It's interesting that you mentioned the air travel component of that, because we did an episode on that pretty recently. But I think it's important to point out that air travel really starts to connect the world in a profound way, where people start to travel a lot more from place to place. Mm-hmm. There was a referendum in Hawaii to vote for whether there should be statehood or not. And apparently 93% of the voters who participated approved the proposal to be a state. However, that's not to say that those who sought the decolonization of Hawaii, they were very critical of this initiative because it meant becoming even more closely connected to the United States. And in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there's a movement known as the Hawaiian Renaissance, which sought to recapture Native Hawaiian ways of life. And during this time, there were a lot of protests against the U.S. Navy, who was bombing Kaluoe, which was a sacred island to the Hawaiians. And so this movement, this cultural movement, starts to develop a really discernible political movement and a move towards sovereignty for the Hawaiians again and independence. And so the Hawaiian sovereignty movement had been going on before, but really got a huge boost at this time. And part of that was tied to this deep opposition to the U.S. military presence in the islands, because, of course, they had been bombed at Pearl Harbor because it was U.S. territory, and the U.S. had this military control. So in 1993, this is an interesting thing. I'm not sure everybody's aware of this. The U.S. government passed Public Law 103-150, that's sometimes called the Apology Resolution. And it passed both houses of Congress and was signed by President Clinton at the time. And the resolution recognizes the illegal manner in which the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown. And here's a direct quote from the document. Acknowledges that the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii occurred with the active participation of agents and citizens of the United States, and further acknowledges that the Native Hawaiian people never directly relinquished to the United States because Queen Liliuokalani didn't give up power to the Republic, but temporary control of the United States was the document as it existed. And so the United States recognized that their inherent sovereignty as a people was threatened through this activity. So the United States, it didn't make everything okay, but it's interesting that this was, the Congress and the president said, yeah, this is incorrect that this happened.
And this is a level of recognition that few indigenous peoples have still yet to receive to this day. I mean, some have, but this seems a little bit more advanced, I would say.
Well, it hasn't resulted in actual territory being given up by the United States, or reclaiming of territorial control by Hawaiian people, by the people who living there since the time of working the sugar plantations. So there continues to be the sovereignty movement for that very reason. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to think about how there's had been a political movement, but how a cultural renaissance really gives a lot of extra strength and power to a political movement. And we talked about the same thing when we talked about the Catalan independence movement on a previous episode. And we would see this in other places as well, is that people start to begin to identify again strongly as a people. Under the modern state system, they want recognition for their own territory, and they want control over their own place.
Yeah, I would say of all states in the United States, I would say Hawaii has definitely one of the strongest and most distinct cultures, right? And a lot of that has to do with this sovereignty movement, right? It's a lot about establishing, hey, this is who we are as a people, this is who we were as a people, and let's bring back some of those customs. And they have been able to do it in a way that really pushes that to a global audience and creates a global narrative about what Hawaii is. Yes, it's part of the United States, but it's also has this very distinct culture that was not given up freely.
That's right. And it's amazing to think that the United States has recognized this, but it's perhaps not surprising that not any particular action relating to who has control of things has happened after that.
Right. Well. Yeah. I mean, I can't see the United States ever willingly giving up Hawaii as island, as setting it free. That as much as that might be,
states don't give up territory. Yeah.
Right. We've talked about this before. States, especially in the sort of the modern economy, right? The modern globalized economy, giving up land is giving up a lot of power projection. And so, unfortunately, it's something I don't ever see happening, barring something really big happening in the global arena. But I think there's definitely things that there's a lot of these sort of areas, and we had an entire episode on Greenland, for example. And Greenland is technically part of the Danish realm, or whatever you want to call it. I can't remember, kingdom of Denmark and Faroe Islands and Greenland. But it also has a lot of its own autonomy. It's still part of that, but it has a lot of its own autonomy. And the United States operates in a similar way, right? Each state has a fair amount of autonomy to do different things. But there is an argument, I think, to be made that some states should have perhaps more autonomy. And maybe Hawaii is one of those states.
Well, I mean, in a very limited way, of course, Native American people in Alaska and the lower 48 have some territory over land. It's not always land that was traditionally the land that they inhabited. So, could that happen? Could that happen in Hawaii, where it becomes a autonomous region? Also seems unlikely because of the vast business interests the United States has there, and the military aspect of things as well. And it's a sign of weakness for a country, apparently, to show, to give any autonomy up. I mean, Canada gave up a lot of autonomy to First People when Nunavut was created, but that's a pretty rare situation, and we don't see that often. This episode, we took a real political geography lens on talking about Hawaii, and there's so many other dimensions and we talked about a few other things, but there's a lot of other dimensions we could talk about, but we probably have to do that in another episode. I did want to end by talking a little bit about tourism in Hawaii, because I think there's a political aspect to that as well. According to the State of Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, over 9.2 million people visited Hawaii in 2022. By air and by cruise ships the vast majority by air, right? So this is to an archipelago that has 1.4 million residents, but received 9.2 million visitors.
That's an incredible statistic.
It's incredible, right? Total expenditures that year were estimated to be $19.8 billion from these people that traveled from other places. So tourism brings in a lot of money, but there's a lot of problems associated with that. And who's benefiting from the money? And Native Hawaiians largely are not. We've talked a bit in previous episodes about how tourism can provide some benefits for a place, but often comes with many costs. And those costs are usually disproportionately felt by people who don't have political power and have lived in this area for a long time, like Native Hawaiians. Tourism is one of the factors that contributes to a massive housing crisis that exists in Hawaii. Homelessness is particularly high for Native Hawaiians. Tourism has heavily strained the water supply in Hawaii, has really taxed the increased energy consumption in Hawaii. Most energy is consumed by people visiting the island, not by people who are resident of the island. And environmental damages continue to worsen as well. And we saw with the wildfires that devastated Maui, killing over 100 people, that put in pretty stark relief the dependence on tourism. And although some people are saying we don't want tourists to come back because people shouldn't be having a good time when we're rebuilding our society here, the need for jobs, the need for money is so great that tourism has started again in Maui. And again, there's so much more to say, and I hope we've done some justice to this story, the political story of Hawaii today. But maybe we'll come back and we'll talk some other aspects of things in a future episode because I think it would be interesting. But for now, that's the time that we have.
Well, and I just wanted to add one last thing to that. And it's maybe just something to observe if you ever do visit Hawaii. And you can basically do this on any island. If you travel inland to the islands, that's where you're going to find most of the native Hawaiians who aren't maybe working at a resort. If you actually are on the coast the entire time, most of the infrastructure, what have you, is owned by the businesses or wealthy people who have a second home there. Or, for example, I think it's Larry Ellison owns an entire island of Hawaii. I can't remember which one it is, but he basically owns an entire island, aside from a very small
almost all the property, right?
All the property. And I believe Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook also owns a large chunk of Maui or maybe it's Kauai. I can't remember which island it is. But it's just interesting to think about that Hawaiians were so tied to the coast, to the ocean, to this way of life, this sailing culture. And yet what has happened over the last 100 years, maybe even longer than that, is that they've been pushed inland away from areas that are perceived as desirable by tourists and the people who want to own a home there and business interests who want to sell that to people who want to visit there. And that's just a very tragic part of the Hawaiian story.
That's the geographies you're talking about are difficult ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's what's happened. Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, Hunter, let's go ahead and do our whatnots, and I will kick it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, with my co-author David Banis and many contributors, including Jeff Gibson, who is my co-host for this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Thanks, Hunter. Yes, my name is Jeff Gibson. I'm co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/little@Geography by Jeff, where you can watch other geography videos of mine there. It's pretty fun. Go check it out. If you want to support us over on Substack, you can find us over there. It's geographyiseverything.substack.com. The podcast lives over there, so you can get it directly into your email box every week. It's totally free. You don't have to pay anything. Just go and sign up, and that's basically an easy way to have access to this.
Check it out.
Let's see. What are we doing next week? I think
you remember? I don't remember.
Yes, I think I do. And it's going to be all about the U.S. Postal Service, which is going to be a really fun episode. Originally, so I've been starting to pull together the research and sort of the what I'm going to talk about. And originally, I was thinking, okay, maybe this is lining up with one of our company episodes, right? Like we did one on IKEA or Lego,
right?
But now I'm like, no, this is something different entirely, because even though it's kind of a quasi corporation, quasi government agency, the U.S. Postal Service has their own geography that has had an incredible impact on this country. The zip code is basically what I'm talking about. And so we're going to talk a lot about the zip code, what it means to have a zip code, what it means to, when people didn't have zip codes, what it means to have a post office to people, and what it perhaps even means even more when that post office gets taken away. There's a lot of geography underpinning that service.
Looking very forward to learning about all that stuff, Jeff. That's going to be really good.
So come back next week. We're going to do a huge geography is the U.S. Postal Service. And well, I guess until then, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.